Essay 810 Engagements to report on summary financial statements. Essay 810 deals with the auditor's responsibilities when undertaking an engagement to report on the summary financial statements derived from financial statements audited in accordance with essays by the same auditor. What does summary financial statements reflect? Summary financial statements reflects historical financial information that is derived from financial statements, but that contains less detail than the financial statements, which still providing a structured representation consistent with that provided by the financial statements of the entity's economic resources or obligations at a point in time or the changes therein for a period of time. Engagement acceptance. The auditor shall ordinarily accept an engagement to report on summary financial statements in accordance with this essay only when the auditor has been engaged to conduct an audit in accordance with the essays of the financial statements from which the summary financial statements are derived. If the auditor has not also audited the financial statements from which the summary financial statements are derived, the auditor shall not have the necessary knowledge to discharge his responsibilities in relation to the summary financial statements in accordance with this essay. Herein lies the rationale behind the requirement that engagement to report on summary financial statements shall ordinarily be accepted when the auditor has been engaged to conduct an audit of financial statements from which the summary financial statements are derived. Before accepting an engagement to report on summary financial statements, the auditor shall determine whether the applied criteria are acceptable. Applied criteria refers to criteria applied by the management in the preparation of the summary financial statements. Management is responsible for the determination of the information that needs to be reflected in the summary financial statements so that they are consistent in all material respects with or represent a fair summary of the audited financial statements. Because summary financial statements, by their nature, contain aggregated information and a limited disclosure, there is an increased risk that they may not contain the information necessary so as not to be misleading in the circumstances. This risk increases when established criteria for the preparation of summary financial statements do not exist. Factors affecting the auditor's determination of the acceptability of the applied criteria: nature of the entity, the purpose of the summary financial statements, the information needs of the intended users of the summary financial statements, and whether the applied criteria will result in summary financial statements that are not misleading in the circumstances. The criteria for the preparation of summary financial statements may be established by an authorized or recognized standard setting organization or by law or regulation. Similar to the case of financial statements, as explained in Essay 210, in many such cases, the auditor may presume that such criteria are acceptable. Where established criteria for the preparation of summary financial statements do not exist, criteria may be developed by the management, for example, based on practice in a particular industry. If the auditor concludes that the applied criteria are unacceptable, or is unable to obtain the agreement of management as discussed above, the auditor shall not accept the engagement to report on the summary financial statements unless required by law or regulation to do so. An engagement conducted in accordance with such law or regulation does not comply with this essay. Accordingly, the auditor's report on the summary financial statements shall not indicate that the engagement was conducted in accordance with this essay. The auditor shall include appropriate reference to this fact in the terms of the engagement. The auditor shall also determine the effect that this may have on the engagement to audit the financial statements from which the summary financial statements are derived. Adequate disclosure of the summarized nature of summary financial statements and the identity of the audited financial statements may, for example, be provided by a title such as Summary Financial Statements prepared from the audited financial statements for the year ended 31st March so and so. Obtain the agreement of management that it acknowledges and understands its responsibility. This is the second point. Second point pertaining to before accepting an engagement to report on summary financial statements, the auditor shall obtain the agreement of the management that it acknowledges and understands its responsibility for the preparation of summary financial statements in accordance with the applied criteria to make the audited financial statement available to the intended users of the summary financial statements without undue difficulty, or if law or regulation provides that the audited financial statements need not be made available to the intended users of the summary financial statements, and establishes the criteria for the preparation of summary financial statements to describe that law or regulation in the summary financial statements. The auditor's evaluation whether the audited financial statements are available to the intended users of the summary financial statements without undue difficulty is affected by factors such as whether the summary financial statements describe clearly from whom or where the audited financial statements are available, the audited financial statements are on public record, or management has established a process by which the intended users of the summary financial statements can obtain ready access to the audited financial statements. To include auditor's report on the summary financial statements in any document that contains the summary financial statements and that indicates the auditor has reported on them. Next, agree with the management on the form of opinion to be expressed on the summary financial statements. Next concept, nature of procedures to be performed by the auditor. The auditor shall perform following procedures and any other procedures that the auditor may consider necessary as the basis for the auditor's opinion on the summary financial statements. Evaluate whether the summary financial statements adequately disclose their summarized nature and identify the audited financial statements. When summary financial statements are not accompanied by the audited financial statements, evaluate whether they describe clearly from whom or where the audited financial statements are available, or the law or regulation that specifies that the audited financial statements need not be made available to the intended users of the summary financial statements, and establishes the criteria for the preparation of summary financial statements. Evaluate whether the summary financial statements adequately disclose the applied criteria. Compare the summary financial statements with the related information in the audited financial statements to determine whether the summary financial statements agree with or can be recalculated from the related information in the audited financial statements. Evaluate whether the summary financial statements are prepared in accordance with the applied criteria. Evaluate in view of the purpose of summary financial statements whether the summary financial statements contains the information necessary and are at appropriate level of aggregation so as not to be misleading in the circumstances. Evaluate whether the audited financial statements are available to the intended users of the summary financial statements without undue difficulty, unless law or regulation provides that they need not be made available, and establishes the criteria for the preparation of the summary financial statements as discussed earlier. Form of opinion. When the auditor has concluded that an unmodified opinion on the summary financial statement is appropriate, the auditor's opinion shall, unless otherwise required by law or regulation, use one of the following phrases. The summary financial statements are consistent in all material respects with the audited financial statements in accordance with the applied criteria, or the summary financial statements are a fair summary of the audited financial statements in accordance with the applied criteria. If law or regulation prescribes the wording of the opinion on summary financial statements in terms that are different from those described above, the auditor shall apply the procedure discussed earlier and any further procedure necessary to enable the auditor to, to express the prescribed opinion and evaluate whether users of the summary financial statements might misunderstand the auditor's opinion on the summary financial statement, and if so, whether additional explanation in the auditor's report on the summary financial statements can mitigate possible misunderstanding. If the auditor concludes that additional explanation in the auditor's report on the summary financial statements cannot possibly misunderstanding, cannot mitigate possible misunderstanding, the auditor shall not accept the engagement unless required by law or regulation to do so. An engagement conducted in accordance with such law or regulation does not comply with this essay. Accordingly, the auditor's report on the summary financial statements shall not indicate that engagement was conducted in accordance with this essay. Auditor's report on summary financial statements. Elements of auditor's report. The auditor's report on summary financial statements shall include the following elements: a title clearly indicating it as a report of an independent auditor, an addressee. If the addressee of the summary financial statements is not the same as the addressee of the auditor's report on the audited financial statements, the auditor shall evaluate the appropriateness of using a different addressee. Factors that may affect the auditor's evaluation of the appropriateness of the addressee of the summary financial statements includes the terms of the engagement, the nature of entity, and the purpose of the summary financial statements. Next, an introductory paragraph. An introductory paragraph identifies the summary financial statements on which the auditor is reporting, including the title of each statement included in the summary financial statements. When the auditor is aware that summary financial statements will be included in a document that contains other information, the auditor may consider, if the form of presentation allows, identifying the page number on which the summary financial statements are presented. This helps readers to identify the summary financial statements to which the auditor's report relates. Identifies the audited financial statements, refers to the auditor's report on the audited financial statements, the date of that report, and in cases other than where audited financial statements contain modified opinion, emphasis of matter paragraph, and other matter paragraph, the fact that an unmodified opinion is expressed on the audited financial statements. If the date of the auditor's report on the summary financial statements is later than the date of the auditor's report on the audited financial statement, states that the summary financial statements and the audited financial statements do not reflect the effects of events that occurred subsequent to the date of the auditor's report on the audited financial statements, and a statement indicating that the summary financial statements do not contain all the disclosures required by the financial reporting framework applied in the preparation of the audited financial statements, and that reading the summary financial statements is not a substitute for reading the audited financial statements. A description of management's responsibility for the summary financial statements, explaining that management is responsible for the preparation of the summary financial statements in accordance with the applied criteria. A statement that the auditor is responsible for expressing an opinion on the summary financial statements based on the procedures required by this essay. A paragraph clearly expressing an opinion, the auditor's signature, along with the firm's registration number, wherever applicable, and the membership number assigned by ICAI. Besides, UDIN is required to be stated. The date of the auditor's report. The auditor shall date the auditor's report on the summary financial statements no earlier than the date on which the auditor has obtained sufficient appropriate evidence on which to base the opinion, including evidence that the summary financial statements have been prepared and those with the recognized authority have asserted that they have taken responsibility for them, and the date of the auditor's report on the audited financial statements. Next, place of signature. Modifications to the opinion, emphasis of matter paragraph, or other matter paragraph in the auditor's report on the audited financial statements. When the auditor's report on the audited financial statements contains a qualified opinion and emphasis of matter paragraph or other matter paragraph, but that the auditor is satisfied that the summary financial statements are consistent in all material respects with are a fair summary of the audited financial statements in accordance with the applied criteria. The auditor's report on the summary financial statements shall also contain following. State that the auditor's report on the audited financial statements contains a qualified opinion, an emphasis of matter paragraph or other matter paragraph, and describe the basis for qualified opinion on the audited financial statements, and that qualified opinion or the emphasis of matter or other matter paragraph in the auditor's report on the audited financial statements and the effect thereof on the summary financial statements, if any. When the auditor's report on the audited financial statements contains an adverse opinion or disclaimer of opinion, the auditor's report on the summary financial statements shall additionally state that the auditor's report on the audited financial statements contains an adverse opinion or disclaimer of opinion, describe the basis for that adverse opinion or disclaimer of opinion, and state that as a result of the adverse opinion or disclaimer of opinion, it is inappropriate to express an opinion on the summary financial statements. Modified opinion on the summary financial statements. If the summary financial statements are not consistent in all material respects with or not a fair summary of the audited financial statements in accordance with the applied criteria, and management does not agree to make the necessary changes, the auditor shall express an adverse opinion on the summary financial statements. Next, restriction on distribution or use or electing users to the basis of accounting. In case of special purpose framework, when distribution or use of the auditor's report on the audited financial statements is restricted, or the auditor's report on the audited financial statements alerts readers that the audited financial statements are prepared in accordance with the special purpose framework, the auditor shall include a similar restriction or alert in the auditor's report on the summary financial statements. Next, comparatives. Comparatives in the audited financial statements may be regarded as corresponding figures or a comparative financial information. If the audited financial statements contains comparatives, but the summary financial statements do not, the auditor shall determine whether such omission is reasonable in the circumstance of the engagement. The auditor shall determine the effect of an unreasonable omission on the auditor's report on the summary financial statements. If the summary financial statements contain some comparatives that were reported on by another auditor, the auditor's report on the summary financial statements shall also contain the matters that SA 710 requires the auditor to include in the auditor's report on the audited financial statements. Unaudited supplementary information presented with summary financial statements. The auditor shall evaluate whether any unaudited supplementary information presented with the summary financial statements is clearly differentiated from the summary financial statements. If the auditor concludes that the entity's presentation of the unaudited supplementary information is not clearly differentiated from the summary financial statements, the auditor shall ask management to change the presentation of the unaudited supplementary information. If management refuses to do so, the auditor shall explain in the auditor's report on the summary financial statements that such information is not covered by that report. Other information in documents containing summary financial statements. The auditor shall read the other information included in a document containing the summary financial statements and related auditor's report to consider whether there is a misstatement, whether there is a material inconsistency between the other information and the summary financial statements. If the auditor identifies a material inconsistency, the auditor shall determine whether the summary financial statements or the other information need to be revised. If the auditor becomes aware that the other information needs to be revised, the auditor shall discuss the matter with management. Auditor association. If the auditor becomes aware that the entity plans to state that the auditor has reported on summary financial statements in a document containing the summary financial statements, but does not plan to include the related auditor's report, the auditor shall request the management to include the auditor's report in the document. If management does not do so, the auditor shall determine and carry out other appropriate actions designed to prevent management from inappropriately associating the auditor with the summary financial statements in the document. The auditor may be engaged to report on the financial statements of an entity while not engaged to report on the summary financial statements. If in this case, the auditor becomes aware that the entity plans to make a statement in a document that refers to the auditor, and the fact that summary financial statements are derived from the financial statements audited by the auditor shall be satisfied that the reference to the auditor is made in the context of the auditor's report on the audited financial statements, and the statement does not give the impression that the auditor has reported on the summary financial statements. If A or B are not met, the auditor shall request the management to change the statement to meet them or not to refer to the auditor in the document. Alternatively, the entity may engage the auditor to report on the summary financial statements and include the related auditor's report in the document. If the management does not change the statement, delete the reference to the auditor or include an auditor's report on the summary financial statements in the document containing the summary financial statements. The auditor shall advise management that the auditor disagrees with the reference to the auditor, and the auditor shall determine and carry out other appropriate actions designed to prevent management from inappropriately referring to the auditor. Next, timing of work and events subsequent to the date of auditor's report on the audited financial statements. When the auditor reports on the summary financial statements after the completion of the audit of the financial statements, the auditor is not required to obtain additional audit evidence on the audited financial statements or report on the effects of the events that occurred subsequent to the date of the auditor's report on the audited financial statements, since the summary financial statements are derived from the audited financial statements.